Hello and welcome to our studies in AQA A-level history, specifically the module concerning democracy and Nazism, the study of Germany from 1918 to 1945. In this first lesson, what we're going to do is talk about the collapse of Imperial Germany. Specifically, and as the specification requires, we're going to talk about the impact of the First World War and the crises of October to November of 1918, sometimes known as the November Revolution. We'll talk about the context for the establishment of the Weimar Constitution. We'll talk about some of the terms, and then we will finish by looking at the strengths and weaknesses of the Weimar Constitution. And I think it should just be noted that where we are beginning our line of inquiry is the study of Imperial Germany, the German Empire, under the reign at the time of Kaiser Wilhelm II. And for the past 4 years, we have seen that the German Empire has been embroiled in the First World War. And the First World War, which takes place from 1914 to 1918, has a profound and a devastating impact on Germany, not just on the battlefield, but also in terms of the socio-political and economic landscape of the country. And so really to begin, we have to think about the impact of this conflict. The war had incredible amounts of human loss in terms of casualties and in terms of the psychological impact of the conflict. It caused approximately 2 million German soldiers to have died, and around 4.5 million were wounded, sort of collectively being around 6.5 million casualties. The civilian death toll was also extensive as well, partially from military actions, partially from disease, but also from starvation. We'll talk about the British naval blockade in a second, but fundamentally not only was the military suffering extensively, but so too was the civilian population. The loss of life in this conflict created what was known as the lost generation and had a deep psychological impact on German society. You can also see that the First World War has a massive psychological impact. So even if you may not have suffered from an actual casualty or have been killed in the war, you may suffer from the psychological toll that such a conflict brings. The use of modern weaponry, like chemical gases, results in high rates of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, among soldiers, all of which contributes to social instability. The war itself also has a profound impact on the economy. The German economy was heavily mobilized for the war effort. It's sometimes what we call a total war economy, the idea being that every single facet of a state's economic capacity is being used to contribute to the ongoing war effort. By the end of the war, inflation began to skyrocket, and the German mark, the currency at the time, began to lose much of its value. In addition to this, the British naval blockade had severely restricted Germany's ability to import goods, leading to food shortages, widespread malnutrition, and contributing to public discontent and dissatisfaction of the government. The First World War was a war that was mostly fought in Europe, fundamentally, and there was not much in the way of a naval conflict between Great Britain and Germany because of Britain's clear superiority in relation to her navy, the Royal Navy. And so the result is that Britain was able to essentially propose or to essentially be able to impose, should I say, a blockade that would severely restrict and ultimately attempt to starve the Germans out of the conflict. War production and the eventual collapse of the war economy would also lead to mass unemployment. All of this means that we start to see social unrest and class struggles as the result of this conflict. We see, for example, that the Social Democratic Party and other left-wing movements begin to gain more and more influence, calling for democratic reforms and, more importantly, an end to this idea of autocratic rule. So this kind of landscape is what we have to think about when we think about the political crisis of October to November 1918. Ultimately, the political crisis begins when Prince Max of Baden messages, sends a letter covertly to the US President, Woodrow Wilson, asking for potential terms of an armistice agreement. Now, this causes a huge amount of shake-up within all of German society, because Germany was under or at least German society was under the impression that they were probably winning the war, or that they were suffering, but there was no clear, dire situation going on in terms of defeat. And so this sort of demanding of or reaching out for armistice terms shattered the perception in the minds of many within both society and within the military. And so in late October 1918, we start to see the collapse of the military, most prominently at Kiel, with a Kiel mutiny. The German Navy, facing imminent defeat, ordered its fleet to make a final suicidal attack on the British Navy. This sparked a Kiel mutiny, where sailors in the port city of Kiel rebelled against their officers and refused to follow the orders. The mutiny would then quickly spread across most of northern Germany, and it signalled ultimately the collapse of military discipline and control. The mutiny, followed by civilian uprisings, marked the beginning of the end for this for this old imperial government, should I say. Led by a number of left-wing groups, we see that soldiers and workers began to take over key cities, demanding change. And it wouldn't be too long before that change is represented with the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II. Now, Kaiser Wilhelm II did not voluntarily abdicate. He was told of his abdication. This was on the 9th of November 1918. As the growing pressure from the military collapse of the revolution, the Kaiser abdicated and fled in exile to the Netherlands. This abdication then signalled the complete end of the German Empire. On the same day, the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, and their leader, Friedrich Ebert, declared the establishment of the Weimar Republic, not necessarily calling it the Weimar Republic at the time, but declaring a republic. We'll get to why it's called the Weimar Republic in a minute, but it's due to circumstances concerning Berlin. While the abdication of the Kaiser led to the creation of this new republic that eventually becomes known as the Weimar Republic, political instability was far from over. In January 1919, for example, we see the Spartacist uprising. This was led by the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD. Now, this was an attempt to establish a socialist government, similar to that of the Bolsheviks in 1917 in Russia. The uprising was crushed by the government with the help of the Freikorps, which was a right-wing paramilitary group. We'll get to the Spartacist uprising in a little bit more detail in future lessons' time, but it should just be noted that the political context of this series of events taking place is very, very important, including an examination of the Spartacist rising. So how do we then get from the declaration of a republic, an overthrow of the monarchy, and an end to imperialism, to the establishment of the Weimar Constitution? Well, it was established, the Constitution, in the wake of this political crisis in 1918. But the collapse of the monarchy and the collapse of Imperial Germany essentially provided the opportunity for the establishment of a new social and political order. We see automatically from the beginning that the imperial system was clearly going to fail. The abdication of the Kaiser and the collapse of the monarchy meant that the existing political system, the imperial system that had existed prior, no longer had any kind of legitimacy. And so the imperial government had to be replaced. It was replaced in the interim between sort of 9th of November 1919 to the point at which we start to see the establishment of the Weimar Assembly in 1919. Those period of a couple of months was it was replaced by a provisional government that was led by the SPD, the Social Democratic Party. In the face of continued unrest, there was the consensus of a new political system that was based on stability and the desire for stability. So the SPD leader, Friedrich Ebert, had become head of this new government and started to play a pivotal role in stabilizing the situation. We see that Ebert worked with the conservative elites, he worked with the military leaders, as well as the industrialists to smooth the transition from monarchy to republic, despite the various different challenges. The SPD also sought to balance the demands of both the left and the right, the revolutionary socialists on one side and the military leaders and conservatives on the other. In January 1919, then, we see the establishment of the Weimar National Assembly. The reason why it was called the Weimar National Assembly is because in a small town of Weimar, just outside of Berlin, was where it was established. It was held in the city or the town of Weimar due to the unrest that was taking place in January 1919 in Berlin, the Spartacist uprising. And so that's the whole reason why we call it the Weimar Republic and the Weimar National Assembly and the Weimar Constitution. The Constitution was drafted and finalized on the 11th of August 1919 and was a progressive document in many respects. And so let's just start to spend some time looking at some of the key terms of the Weimar Constitution as well as its strengths and weaknesses. In terms of key terms, then, the most important terms that you could pick out from the Weimar Constitution includes elections. Elections on the basis of a proportional representation system. Essentially, what a proportional representation system means is when you elect an assembly or a parliament or something like that, it is a proportional representation if the percentage of votes that a political party gets roughly matches the percentage of seats that they are awarded in that parliament. In the UK, for example, we have a system called first past the post, and it is not proportional. There is a huge disparity between the percentage of votes versus the percentage of seats. The desire for a proportional representation system means that smaller parties have the ability to gain influence and traction and gain seats, and it also means that it broadly represents the German population at in a greater way. And so the system would be proportional, and so therefore the number of seats in the Reichstag was allocated based on the percentage of votes each party received in elections. In addition to this, the president was to be directly elected by the people for a 7-year term. The president had significant powers, one of which includes the ability to appoint a chancellor, which becomes problematic later on, as well as the ability to dissolve the Reichstag. The chancellor would be appointed by the president, as I've just noted, and was the head of government who was responsible for running the executive branch of the government. So the Reichstag represented the legislative branch, the branch of government that was going to essentially create laws, create legislation, and the Chancellor represented the executive branch to execute those laws, to implement those laws. The Constitution also included a certain Bill of Rights, a sense of Bill of Rights, guaranteeing freedoms of speech, assembly, and freedom of the press. All very, very progressive principles for a constitution that was established in 1919. And so when we think about its strengths and weaknesses, you could argue that from the perspective of strengths, it was a democratic constitution. It was one of the most democratic frameworks in the world at the time. It had universal suffrage for both men and women over the age of, I believe, 21, and it was committed to civil liberties with the Bill of Rights principles. The structure of government also, with having a separate executive branch headed by the Chancellor, a separate legislative branch that is overseen by the Reichstag, and a separate judicial branch, meant that there was checks and balances and a separation of powers, whereby you could see that one power institution can check the other and ensure that no one institution gets too powerful. The Constitution also included provisions for social welfare, including things like unemployment benefits and workers' rights. Again, another very, very, very progressive element of the Weimar Constitution. So, with all those strengths being associated with the Weimar Constitution, what then were the weaknesses? I'd also add as a strength is it abolished the imperial autocracy. It essentially replaces what was an imperial state, it replaces a monarchy that had absolute control, and it ensured that monarchy would never again enter into the world of German politics. Let's think about the weaknesses then. The first is this difficulty with proportional representation. So, on the one hand, proportional representation is very democratic. But on the other hand, it leads to quite a lot of fragmentation, especially within the Reichstag, because where the number of votes represents the number of seats you get, or the percentage votes that represents the percentage of seats you get, it means that most of the time, because the politics is so fragmented, that no one party ever gets a majority within the Reichstag, and so they have to form what are known as coalitions. So ultimately, groups of parties that have to work together to try and form a majority collectively. This results in frequent changes in the government because ultimately these coalition parties are not aligned with each other. They have different ideologies, and so they have different visions for what is going to be the best approach to whatever policy. It also means that extremist parties like the Nazi Party and like the Communist Party, the KPD and the NSDAP, are able to gain a foothold as well, which we'll get to in future lessons. Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution included provisions for emergency powers, which essentially allows the president to rule by decree in times of emergency and bypasses the Reichstag. We see that this is a provision that was exploited quite extensively by President Hindenburg in future lessons' time, and then eventually it will start to be exploited by Hitler, especially in 1934 when he merges the chancellorship and the presidency together to become the Führer. The division of powers between the president and the chancellor then also created tension and confusion, especially when the president and the chancellor were from different parties or had conflicting priorities. And it also meant that deference to the president would always come first, given that he could dismiss and get rid of whatever chancellor he so chose and appoint a new chancellor. We see this when we see the sort of revolving door of chancellors again in the 1930s, late 20s, 1930s, when you start to see people like von Schleicher, von Papen, and then eventually Adolf Hitler enter into the role of becoming chancellor. And then finally, many conservative and military elites never fully embraced the Weimar Republic and the Weimar Constitution, which ultimately undermines its legitimacy and makes it very vulnerable to right-wing coups and to general political unrest.